Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Hmm.
Today we'll be exploring a pretty incredible book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh, yeah.
And I think a lot of people, when they hear that title, they think kind of self-help, right?
Yeah.
But this book is so much more than just like a, feel-good self-help book.
Right.
This is a really profound exploration of the human spirit in the face of just unimaginable suffering. We're talking about Frankl's experiences in Nazi concentration camps and how he discovered a path to meaning amidst just absolute horror.
It's true. And what's really amazing is he doesn't just recount his story, he uses it as a foundation to develop logotherapy, his unique approach to psychotherapy.
Okay, so logotherapy. That's a good place to start, I think.
Yeah.
Can you kind of unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah.
What exactly is logotherapy?
Sure, logotherapy is centered on the idea that our primary drive in life is the will to meaning. We are driven to find meaning in our lives, and this drive is even stronger than our drive for pleasure or power.
Okay. And so how does that tie into his experiences in the camps?
Well, his time in the camps really solidified this idea for him. He saw that even in the most horrific circumstances, those who could find meaning in their suffering were more likely to survive.
So it's not just about enduring hardship. It's about finding a reason to endure.
Exactly. And that's what logotherapy seeks to help people do. Find that reason to endure, that will to meaning.
Now, the book itself is divided into two parts, right?
Yeah.
Part one is Frankl's deeply personal account of life in the camps.
That's right.
And then part two is where he really lays out the principles of logotherapy.
Yeah, lays out the ideas more specifically.
But even before we get into part one, there's this incredible preface by Gordon Allport
Oh, yeah, it's a great preface.
that really gives us some insight into Frankl's thinking.
Yeah, for sure.
And one of the things that Allport highlights is this question that Frankl would ask his patients. And it's a really powerful one. Why do you not commit suicide?
It's a heavy question.
Yeah, and not meant to be like shocking or anything, but like really searching for that glimmer of meaning, that one little thread that's keeping them holding on to life.
Exactly. It wasn't a judgment. It was an exploration into what was keeping them going. What was that spark of hope or purpose that was preventing them from giving up?
It makes me think about, in our own lives, sometimes when we face really difficult situations,
Sure.
what is that thing that keeps us going? What's that why?
Right. And that seems to really get at the core of logotherapy, this idea that even when everything seems unbearable, there's still this reason why we keep going.
Exactly.
Logotherapy recognizes that even amidst suffering, we have a responsibility to find meaning. And this brings us to Frankl's own journey in Auschwitz. The brutality he describes is just chillin', the selections, the dehumanization, the stripping away of everything familiar.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is. And one anecdote that always strikes me is the moment he chooses to discard a manuscript containing years of his life's work.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
He just lets it go.
Right? He just lets it go. And I think that signifies a profound surrender to the present. By letting go of his past work, Frankl was choosing to embrace the reality of the camps. However harsh it was a really powerful act of acceptance, a testament to the human ability to adapt, even in the most extreme circumstances.
It makes you wonder what we cling to in our own lives. It
Yeah.
might be holding us back from really being present.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a powerful question to consider. But I think it's important to acknowledge that facing those conditions day after day must have taken a psychological toll.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So how did Frankl and I guess others in the camp cope with that? How did they deal with the constant psychological pressure?
Well, Frankl describes 3 distinct psychological phases that concentration camp inmates went through.
Okay.
The first is shock and emotional detachment.
Oh, wow. So like a numbness.
Exactly. It's almost like a defense mechanism that the mind uses to cope. But suicidal thoughts are incredibly prevalent during this stage.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're shutting down emotionally just to survive, that emptiness must be incredibly difficult.
It is, and it often leads to phase 2, which is characterized by apathy and a kind of emotional death. Frankl actually describes watching a fellow prisoner being beaten and feeling nothing. His emotions were completely blunted.
That's heartbreaking. To be so overwhelmed by suffering that you lose the ability to even feel.
It really underscores the profound impact that trauma can have on the human psyche, but the journey doesn't end there. The third phase happens after liberation.
Oh, so even after they're free, there's another phase.
Right. Frankl writes about depersonalization, the struggle to feel joy, the need to almost relearn happiness.
So even after the physical imprisonment is over, there's still this internal battle to reconnect with the world.
Exactly. It highlights the long-lasting impact of the camps. But, and this is important, Frankl's observations weren't all bleak.
Oh, really?
He also noticed these surprising elements of camp life, these little glimmers of resilience that defied all expectations.
What do you mean? What did he see?
Well, for example, he talks about their ability to endure sleep deprivation and how, despite terrible hygiene, many prisoners actually had healthier gums than before.
That's so strange. How is that even possible?
It's hard to say for sure, but it might have something to do with the simplicity of their diet and the fact that they weren't consuming processed foods or sugary drinks.
Interesting.
Yeah.
He also talks about their attempts to find humor, right?
Yes, these small acts of defiance against the crushing weight of their circumstances.
There's that anecdote about the surgeon imagining himself back in the operating room
Oh, yeah.
with the orderly shouting, "Action! Action!" just like the camp foreman.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of what some might call gallows humor, but it demonstrates their incredible resilience and their need to find moments of lightness in the darkest of places.
I guess even in those circumstances, laughter, even dark laughter, could be a lifeline.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the power of perspective. Even in the midst of horror, they found ways to appreciate the smallest reprieves. And Frankl also discusses the concept of relative suffering, how even small joys held immense value in the camps.
Right. Didn't he talk about the time they celebrated realizing their train wasn't going to Mauthausen?
Yes, a camp known for its brutality.
It's just incredible how, even in that horrific environment, they could find reasons to be grateful. But for Frankl, the true search for meaning was an internal one. He had to find a way to make sense of it all when the world around him had been stripped bare.
That's right. He recognized that true freedom wasn't about escaping the camps, but about finding meaning within them.
So how did he do that? How did he find meaning when everything seemed meaningless?
Well, he talks about the power of love even in the face of suffering. His wife, though physically absent, was a source of strength for him. He also used mental exercises to detach from his pain, imagining himself lecturing about the psychology of the camps.
Wow. So instead of letting his mind be consumed by his surroundings, he created a different reality for himself.
Precisely. He understood the importance of having a future goal, something to hold on to. He shares this really tragic story about a prisoner who clung to the hope of liberation on March 30th, only to die on that very day.
Oh, wow. That's so sad. It really highlights how a loss of hope can be just as devastating as physical hardship.
Exactly. And that's why in part 2 of the book, Frankl delves into the principles of logotherapy. He defines it as the search for meaning and responsibility in life. He uses some complex terms to describe these ideas, things like existential frustration, nogenic neuroses, and the existential vacuum.
Yeah, those are some big words. Can
Yeah.
you break those down for us?
Of course.
Ugh.
So let's start with existential frustration. This refers to the feeling of meaninglessness that can arise when our will to meaning is blocked. It's like hitting a wall on your path to purpose.
So it's not just about feeling sad. It's about feeling like your life lacks direction.
Exactly. And that can lead to what Frankl calls neurogenic neuroses. These aren't your typical neuroses stemming from psychological conflicts. They come from a deeper place, from struggling with the big questions of life and finding them unanswered.
So it's like an existential crisis, feeling lost in a vast, meaningless universe.
Exactly. Frankl calls that the existential vacuum, that feeling of emptiness and lack of purpose that can seep into our lives. He even suggests this existential vacuum contributes to what he calls the mass neurotic syndrome, particularly among young people.
What does that look like? What are the signs of this mass neurotic syndrome?
Think depression, aggression, addiction. Frankl sees these not just as isolated issues, but as symptoms of a deeper societal problem, a yearning for meaning that's often ignored or suppressed in our modern world.
That's pretty profound. So how do we combat this existential vacuum? How do we cultivate meaning in a world that often feels meaningless?
Frankl suggests several pathways. He emphasizes personal responsibility. He argues that even in suffering, we have choices. He encourages us to find meaning in our actions, our relationships, and our creative pursuits. You know, things that give us a sense of purpose.
He also talks about finding meaning through suffering,
He does.
which seems counterintuitive at first.
It does. It's not about glorifying suffering. It's about understanding that even in unavoidable pain, we can choose how we respond.
So it's about finding that space within ourselves to choose our attitude even when things are really tough.
Exactly. It's about cultivating resilience not through denial, but through a deeper understanding of our own capacity for meaning-making.
That's such a powerful concept,
Yeah.
but it also feels like a lot to process. Where do we even begin to apply these ideas in our own lives?
It starts with awareness, paying attention to what motivates you, what gives you a sense of purpose, what values guide your actions, where do you find meaning in your daily life?
It's about introspection, taking the time to understand ourselves and what we stand for. And that's a great place to pause for now. We'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into man's search for meaning. Welcome back to our deep dive into man's search for meaning. We were just talking about how Frankl encourages us to find meaning in our actions, our relationships, and our creative pursuits.
Yes, and he also challenges us to find meaning even in suffering, which can be a really tough concept to grasp.
It is. So how do we do that? How can we possibly find meaning in pain and hardship?
Well, Frankl's not saying we should seek out suffering or enjoy it. It's more about recognizing that suffering is an inevitable part of life, and that even in those difficult moments, we have a choice.
A choice about how we respond.
Exactly. We can choose to let suffering break us, or we can choose to find meaning within it to use it as an opportunity for growth.
So it's about changing our perspective on suffering.
Yeah. Yes, and it's also about taking responsibility for our own lives. Frankl argues that we always have a choice, even in the concentration camps. He observed that some prisoners were able to maintain their dignity and find purpose, even in the most horrific circumstances.
It's incredible to think about that kind of resilience. But it makes you wonder, what about those who couldn't find meaning? What happened to them?
Frankl observed that those who gave up hope, those who lost their sense of purpose, were more likely to succumb to the horrors of the camps.
So hope really was a lifeline.
Absolutely. And this is where Frankl introduces the idea of tragic optimism.
Okay, so what is tragic optimism?
It's this idea that we can accept that life has tragic elements like suffering, guilt, and death, but still choose to find meaning within those experiences.
So it's not about denying the negative, but about finding the positive even in the midst of it.
Exactly. It's about facing life's challenges with courage and dignity, even when it feels like everything is falling apart.
Frankl uses a really powerful example to illustrate this point, right? The story of Jerry Long.
Oh, yes. Jerry Long was a young man who became paralyzed in a diving accident.
And despite his immense suffering, he chose to find meaning and purpose in his new life.
He did. He famously said, "I broke my neck. It didn't break me."
That's such a powerful statement, and it really embodies that spirit of tragic optimism. But it also begs the question, can we truly choose our attitude in any given situation?
Frankl would argue that yes, we can. While we may not be able to control what happens to us, we can control how we respond.
So even when things are completely beyond our control, we still have that inner freedom to choose our attitude.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of a gas filling a chamber. He says, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little.
So we can't always control the amount of suffering we experience.
Right, but we can choose how we let it affect us.
It's about finding that space within ourselves that allows us to choose meaning, even in the face of pain.
Yes, and that's the heart of logotherapy. It's about empowering individuals to take responsibility for their own lives, to find meaning in their experiences, and to live with purpose, even when faced with adversity.
That's a really powerful message, but it also feels like a lot to process. Where do we even begin to apply these ideas in our own lives?
It starts with awareness. Pay attention to what motivates you, what gives you a sense of purpose, what values guide your actions.
It's about taking the time to really understand ourselves.
Exactly. And then it's about making choices that align with those values, choices that move us towards a more meaningful life.
It might mean stepping outside our comfort zones, taking risks, facing challenges head on.
It might. And that's where the growth happens. When we push ourselves beyond our limits, when we embrace the full spectrum of human experience, that's when we truly start to live.
Frankl's message is really a call to action, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a challenge to live a life that's not just comfortable, but truly meaningful.
It is. It's a reminder that we have the power to create meaning in our lives, even in the face of suffering.
And that's a great place to pause for now. We'll be back in just a moment to explore the final part of our deep dive into man's search for meaning. Welcome back to our deep dive into man's search for meaning. We've been exploring this idea of finding meaning even in the midst of suffering.
Yes, and it's a concept that Frankl really emphasizes throughout the book.
He does. And one of the things we talked about earlier was this idea of the mass neurotic syndrome.
Right.
And how it's so prevalent today, especially among young people.
And it's interesting because Frankl observed this trend back in the mid-20th century.
Yeah, he did.
And it seems even more relevant now.
It really does.
And he connected this syndrome directly to the existential vacuum, that feeling of emptiness and meaninglessness.
Right. So he's saying that issues like depression, aggression, addiction, they're not just isolated problems. They're symptoms of a much larger societal issue.
Exactly. He argued that when we lack a sense of meaning, when we don't have that why, we become vulnerable to these negative patterns.
We're constantly searching for something to fill that void.
We are. And we often end up chasing fleeting pleasures, distractions, anything to numb the pain of emptiness.
It makes you think about how we live today.
It does.
We're bombarded with information, entertainment, endless possibilities.
Right.
But does any of it truly satisfy that deeper yearning for meaning?
That's the question Frankl wants us to ask.
Yeah.
He doesn't offer easy answers, but he provides a framework for finding our own unique paths.
So instead of giving us a step-by-step guide, he gives us the tools to figure it out for ourselves.
Exactly. He reminds us that meaning isn't something we find out there in the world, it's something we create within ourselves.
So it starts with understanding ourselves, right?
Yes, understanding our values, our strengths, our weaknesses, our place in the world.
Our purpose.
Exactly.
And then it's about taking action.
It is. It's about making choices that align with those values, choices that move us toward a more meaningful life.
It might mean stepping outside our comfort zones, right? Taking risks, facing challenges head on.
Absolutely. Because growth often comes from discomfort.
And from those experiences, we learn and evolve.
We do.
Now, Frankl doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of life either.
No, he doesn't.
He talks about guilt, death, the tragic elements woven into our human experience.
He does, but even in the face of those inevitabilities, he maintains this sense of tragic optimism.
This idea that we can still find meaning even in the midst of suffering.
Exactly. He argues that we can choose to find meaning. We can choose to live with courage and dignity even when circumstances feel beyond our control.
It's a powerful message that resonates across generations.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into man's search for meaning, what's the one takeaway you hope our listeners will hold on to?
I think the most important thing to remember is that even in the darkest times amidst suffering, we have the freedom to choose our attitude.
To find meaning.
Yes, to find meaning, to live a life that matters.
It's a challenge, for sure.
It is.
But it's also an incredible opportunity.
It is. And Frankl's words really capture this beautifully. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that man's search for meaning is his primary motivation in life.
Yeah.
It's not just some secondary rationalization of instinctual drives.
Right. It's this fundamental drive that's at the core of who we are.
Exactly. And this meaning is unique and specific to each individual.
We all have to find our own path.
We do. So I guess the question for all of us is, what will your search for meaning reveal?
That's a great question. And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It's a book that has touched countless lives, and we hope that our conversation has inspired you to continue your own search for meaning.
And to remember that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope.